The Forerunner 165 provides some of the best balance between price and performance in the Garmin lineup, and in this video I'm gonna use a bunch of data to show you why I think that is and why this is the Garmin I would likely choose to buy for myself. Still, this watch is far from perfect and there are a few choices that Garmin made that I'm not completely happy with. In this video we'll test the heart rate tracking performance of the Forerunner 165 during 4 different types of workouts. We will also compare the sleep stage tracking against an EEG headband that can actually measure my brainwaves, and finally we will take a look at the GPS tracking performance. And as I said, all of this will be based on actual data analysis. Let's get to it. Hello everyone, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now, I don't want to go into the specs of this watch too much since the focus in my reviews is on actual independent testing of devices, but there's one thing that bugs me about some of the Garmin watches, and that includes the Forerunner 165. For some reason, Garmin tends to exclude certain sports profiles and sensor connections from their lower to medium tier watches, and that's also what they did for this watch. So certain types of sports will not be available on the Forerunner 165, and also certain external sensors like power meters or smart trainers. They cannot be connected, but this is only possible on the more expensive watches. And I suspect much of this is not really a technical limitation, but just a choice they make to differentiate their watches. Especially for the sports profiles, I imagine it would just be a matter of porting over the firmware from another watch and it would work fine. So they're quite likely intentionally limiting these watches. Maybe I'm wrong and the hardware somehow limits these more lower end watches like this Forerunner 165, but I suspect it's just a firmware choice. That being said, those relatively small differences would not want to make me pay almost double for instance, the Forerunner 265, and I would still go for this 165 instead. If you want a more detailed comparison, Ray from DC Rainmaker, for instance, made a nice video about this. What I care about most is performance. So let's take a look at how the Forerunner 165 did in my testing and how it compared to many of the other watches I've tested over the last years. And as always, I want to start off by looking at the heart rate tracking performance of the Forerunner 165 during different exercises. And here you can see an overview of that performance for one of the easiest exercises for a watch to track cycling indoors, which I tested on myself for 3 sessions. Now, to test the performance, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the Forerunner 165 against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. Now, each dot in this plot is a single heart rate measurement, with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the Forerunner 165. Now, the closer the points are to this blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color the more dots set are. And as you can see, overall the agreement is generally pretty good. Most points are on or at least close to the blue line, though there are some points above it and especially some points below it. Now, if the points are below the blue line, that means that in these moments the Forerunner 165 detected a too low heart rate. We can also see that the correlation, this R value up here, is pretty decent, though not amazing, at 0.93. Now, the correlation cannot be higher than 1, so 0.93 is pretty good, though there are definitely better watches out there. But let's take a look at the individual spinning sessions to see why there's some points below the blue line. And here you can see the first example interval spinning session, where we actually see a pretty decent agreement between the Forerunner 165 and the Polar H10. So along the horizontal axis we have the clock time, and my heart rate is along the vertical axis, with in blue-green the heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red my heart rate according to the Forerunner 165. And as you can see, for this ride the agreement is pretty decent. Only sometimes the Forerunner 165 wasn't fully able to detect my dip in heart rate. Especially here in the beginning when I had this dip in heart rate, it detected a too high heart rate. And also right here and right here there were some moments of a too high heart rate. And also this dip right here wasn't fully detected, but it was mostly detected, so it looks pretty good. And there are some minor moments where it detects a too low heart rate, for instance right here and right here. But overall looking pretty good, I would say. And for the second spinning session, we see more or less the same thing actually. Especially in the beginning, the watch seems to struggle detecting my dips in heart rate. Later on, it looks better. And also right here in the beginning, it seems to need a bit of time to catch up with my real heart rate. So this is likely why there are some points below the blue line. Still, overall, it looks pretty good, with some small delays also right here, here, and here in detecting an increase in my heart rate. But overall, honestly, pretty solid with just some minor deviations. And also for this third ride, we see more or less the same thing. It might even even be a bit better. Most of the peaks and dips in my heart rate were correctly detected. Only here in the beginning it needed a bit of time to catch up with my real heart rate, and there's some small delays in it picking up a change in my heart rate. For instance, right here and right here for that increase in heart rate, and right here for that decrease in heart rate. But overall, this would be good enough for me for cycling indoors. Next, let's compare this performance to that of other watches. This will help you get some idea if the Forerunner 165 should be your top choice, or if maybe you should go for another watch. And that overview is displayed right here. Now the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric I will use for this, which is displayed along the horizontal axis. And we want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. On the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher the device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And here I marked the Forerunner 165 in red. And as you can see, it's in the upper middle class of watches. So pretty decent, likely good enough, but there are better devices out there. But let's zoom in a bit so we can read those labels better and see which watches are close and which ones are significantly better. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here. So these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.8 or higher. And as you can see, another device that's very close to it is, for instance, the Forerunner 965, which has the same sensor, so that makes sense. And that's true for more Garmin watches with the same sensor, like the Fenix 7, but also the Garmin Forerunner 255. So no matter which Forerunner you get, the 165, 255, or 965, you're probably gonna get a similar performance. Now, other similar watches include some Galaxy watches, but also the Fitbit Charge 6 and Whoop Strap 4.0. But there are better devices out there, at least in my testing. Now, as regular viewers will know, these include Apple watches, some selected Huawei watches, but also, for instance, the Pixel Watch 2. And when I tested them, the Fenix 7 Pro and Epix 2 Pro from Garmin did perform better, and they do have a newer sensor, though I cannot really explain why the Garmin Venue 3 is then not doing better with a similar sensor. Still, I think the performance of the Forerunner 165 is good enough for almost anybody for cycling indoors. Overall, the Garmin Forerunner 165 is doing about as well as I expected, since it's quite close to other Garmin devices I tested before, many of which have the exact same sensor set. But let's now make things more difficult, and let's see how the Forerunner 165 did for running outside. This is a bit more difficult because of the increased bumpiness. Let's have a look. And an overview of that is displayed right here, similar to before, but now for running. And as you can see, overall the agreement is pretty good. Most points are again on or close to the blue line, especially here in the high heart rate range, things look pretty good. In the medium to low heart rate range, there's a bit more deviation, but the correlation, this R value, is pretty good at 0.97. But again, let's take a look at the individual runs to see why there's some points above and below the blue line in the lower heart rate range. And here you can see the first example run, and as you can see, this looks pretty good. The heart rate according to the Forerunner 165 in red follows along almost perfectly with the blue line, only the details are sometimes a bit different. So here the peak in my heart rate wasn't fully detected, and the same goes for this dip right here and this dip right here. But overall, this looks quite good. And we see the same thing for this second running session. The heart rate in red follows along really well with the blue-green line. And that's also what we see for this last example running session. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the performance of the Forerunner 165 for tracking my heart rate while running. And here we have a similar overview for running. And again, we want the watches to be as far to the top right as possible. And as you can see, compared to other devices, the Forerunner 165 did pretty well. It's actually quite close to, for instance, the Venue 3 and the Vivo Active 5, but honestly also still very close to the Forerunner 965. So likely both are performing more or less the same. And the slight difference between the Forerunner 165 and Forerunner 965 is likely a combination between random noise, plus the fact that I used to do more interval runs and now I do more steady runs. So it's not a completely fair comparison. But as you can see, many watches are actually doing quite well for running. Again, Apple watches are doing the best. The Coral Space 3 is also doing quite well. And I'm also quite happy with, for instance, the Pixel Watch 2. Still, for running, the Forerunner 165 is one of my top choices at the moment. So that's looking really good, and I'm quite happy about this, given that this is exactly what this watch was designed for, running. We also see no issues with cadence lock, which is really good to see. Many watches tend to confuse the noise created by your running frequency with heart rate, but this is not an issue at all for the Forerunner 165. The watch is also relatively lightweight, which probably plays to its advantage. However, let's now make things even more difficult by looking at a much more difficult exercise for a watch to track: outdoor cycling. I tested the Forerunner 165 for a total of 13 bike rides. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. Also, I'm trying to become part of the first people who receive watches to review from companies like Garmin in this case, and they've actually never sent me a watch before release. And if you want to help me make that happen, it would really help if you like, subscribe and or comment. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion, let's take a look at the performance of the Forerunner 165 for cycling. And by now you're familiar with this type of overview, but this is for cycling outside. And as you can see, this doesn't look quite as good. The correlation is a lot lower now at 0.65, and there's quite a few points below the blue line, indicating that in these moments the watch detected a too low heart rate. And in case you're curious, you might wonder what this red line means. This red line means that in these moments the watch detected half of the actual heart rate, since sometimes when the watch struggles it will detect half or double the heart rate. But given that there's so many points right here below the blue line, let's take a look at the individual cycling sessions to see what's actually going on here. And here you can see the first example bike ride I wanted to share with you. And this really exemplifies the problem of the Forerunner 165 when tracking my heart rate while biking outside. Here, for instance, you can see I had an increase in heart rate, but the Forerunner 165 detected a decrease in my heart rate. And also right here, it wasn't able to keep up with that increase in heart rate. Only the moment I stopped cycling, so I had to take a break right here and right here, in those moments it was able to catch up with my heart rate again, but probably there was more tension on my arms and more bumpiness when I was actually cycling, and the watch just wasn't able to keep up with this. And that's also what we see for this example bike ride. A lot of the peaks in heart rate, but also some dips were missed. This one actually looks a bit better, but again, some peaks in my heart rate were missed. And that's generally what we see for most cycling sessions. A lot of the peaks in my heart rate are missed or at least delayed. So overall, not a very good performance for the Forerunner 165. And again, this is a similar overview to before, but now for biking outside. And as you can see, the Forerunner 165 isn't amongst the top performing watches. It's even to the lower middle end of watches. And unsurprisingly, it's close to many of the other Garmin watches out there. Most Garmin watches are in a rough correlation range between 0.6 and 0.8 for cycling outside. And all of this isn't good enough for me, at least, for tracking my heart rate during cycling outside. It is up to you, of course, what you think is a good enough performance. And as I said, it might perform differently on others, but at least on me, these watches aren't good enough. And this rough spread in performance of different Garmin watches, many of which have the same sensor, is likely a combination of random noise, plus the fact that they have different weights, and some do have newer or older sensors. Still, in general, I cannot recommend any Garmin watch at the moment for cycling outside, at least not based on my experience. I'm not saying there are worse devices out there, but there are definitely better devices out there for tracking my heart rate during cycling outside. Still, luckily, almost all of them do allow you to connect an external ECG heart rate monitor, which is probably what I recommend you do if you buy a Garmin watch for cycling outside. Now, as you probably agree, that's not looking too good, but it is in line with how most Garmin watches generally perform on me. Most Garmin watches struggle to track my heart rate when it comes to cycling outside. However, as we saw before, they can do better on other people sometimes, so I always recommend also checking out some other reviewers. Talking about exercises that are hard to track for watches, let's next take a look at weightlifting. Weightlifting is also one of those exercises that most watches struggle with because there's so much tension on my arm. Let's have a look. So here we have that overview for weightlifting, and as you can see, in the lower heart rate range, most points are on or close to the blue line, so that looks pretty okay. But in the higher heart rate range, the watch really struggles. So this likely means that the moment that I start a set of exercises, my heart rate increases, and the Forerunner 165 isn't able to detect this. And this is what we've seen for many watches. That increased tension on my arm makes it very hard for the watch to detect my heart rate, and it just isn't able to keep up. And this is also the reason why the correlation isn't very high at 0.73. But again, let's take a look at the individual weightlifting sessions so we can get an idea of the number of peaks it was able to detect. And here we have the first example weightlifting session, where we actually see that some of the peaks in my heart rate were detected, but some were not. So near the end, more peaks were detected, but especially in the beginning, many of the peaks in my heart rate were missed. So during all these peaks, I was doing a set of an exercise, and just that increased tension made it really hard for the Forerunner 165 to detect my heart rate accurately. And that's also what we see for this second example weightlifting session. Some of the peaks were detected, so better than some watches out there, but not all of the peaks were detected, so it's a bit hit and miss. And in this overview right here, we can compare the Garmin Forerunner 165 to many of the other watches out there. And similar to before, it's close to, for instance, the Forerunner 965, but also the Garmin Forerunner 255. So the same sensor with not that different a weight is doing about the same, which is of course roughly what we expected. It's somewhere in the middle range of all watches, though I would say all of them in this rough range right here aren't good enough for tracking my heart rate during weightlifting. I would honestly only pick watches with a correlation of 0.9, preferably 0.95 or higher for tracking my heart rate during weightlifting, which basically means you're limited to Apple Watches, some selected Huawei watches, and potentially the Pixel Watch 2 and Fitbit Charge 6. But again, similar to what I said for cycling, I would really recommend connecting an ECG chest strap for tracking your heart rate during weightlifting. So for weightlifting, the Forerunner 165 is somewhere in the middle of the pack, I would say. It's not the best and not the worst out there. And as you might have expected, it performs similarly to most other Garmin devices with the same sensor. Still, I don't think the heart rate tracking of Garmin watches during weightlifting gives consistent and reliable enough results. As always, I would always recommend using an ECG chest strap if you really want the most accurate heart rate tracking during weightlifting. Overall, considering all exercises, I give the heart rate tracking of the Forerunner 165 around 3.5 out of 5 stars, I would say. It's really quite good during running, honestly, and good enough while cycling indoors, but at least on me, not good enough during outdoor cycling and weightlifting. But okay, enough about heart rate. Let's now take a look at the sleep stage tracking performance of the Forerunner 165, which I tested during a total of 10 nights. Now to test the sleep stage tracking performance, I'll compare the Forerunner 165 against the Z-Max EEG headband, which can actually measure my brainwaves. This device also has its limitations, especially when it comes to detecting awake time, but it will give us a general impression of the sleep stage tracking performance of the Forerunner 165. And here you can see an overview of the sleep test results. Now on top are the sleep stages as recorded by the Z-Max EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Forerunner 165. Now each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Z-Max was predicted as each sleep stage by the Forerunner 165. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. Now, first of all, we see that about 60% of what was deep sleep according to the EEG device was also deep sleep according to the Forerunner 165. So that's pretty decent, with most confusion in this case being with light sleep at about 37%. Now, light sleep agreement is pretty decent at 78%, and most confusion is either with REM sleep or with deep sleep. Now, REM sleep shows the worst agreement out of all sleep stages, with only a 44% agreement with the EEG device, and a lot is actually confused with light sleep instead. But we'll take a look at the individual nights in a second to see how bad this actually is, because it's a bit better than these percentages make it seem. Now, as I said, we won't focus on awake time detection because the EEG device probably overestimates this a little bit, or at least it detects a lot of these short awake moments that are probably not too relevant for the awake time that the Garmin Forerunner 165 is trying to detect. But just for completeness, there's about a 36% agreement. But it's really important to take a look at some example nights to get a better idea of what's going on here. And here you can see the first example night I wanted to share with you. On top we have the sleep stages according to the Z-Max EEG headband, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom we have a similar plot, but now for the Forerunner 165. And here in purple I highlighted the deep sleep as recorded by the EEG device. And as you can see, this agrees pretty well with the deep sleep recorded by the Forerunner 165. It's just that the Forerunner 165 detects some extra deep sleep. So it detects some more deep sleep right here, but also near the end of the night right here and right here. So overall looking pretty good. And that's also what we see for this second night right here, a pretty decent overlap between the Forerunner 165 and the EEG device, as you can see on the bottom right here. And that's actually the general pattern we see for most nights. Most of the deep sleep detected by the EEG device is also detected by the Forerunner 165, but sometimes the Forerunner detects a bit of extra deep sleep, and occasionally it also misses some of the deep sleep, but overall pretty decent. Next, let's take a look at the REM sleep agreement, and here I mark the REM sleep as detected by the EEG device in red. And as you can see, again, we have a pretty decent agreement between the Forerunner 165 and the EEG device. It's just that where the EEG device detected some awake moments, the Forerunner 165 detected REM sleep right here, but the other segments agree pretty well. Only here near the end, the EEG device detects some extra REM sleep, where I was intermittently asleep and awake, and I had some REM sleep. The Forerunner 165 said I was already awake, but overall for this night it looks pretty decent, I would say. For this night, on the other hand, it looks a little bit worse. So some of the REM sleep segments agree, especially these last two right here. The duration and position is a bit different. Also, the second REM sleep segment, which is right here, is shifted a bit and also a bit shorter according to the Garmin Forerunner 165. And this first very short one was missed. So for this night, it looks a bit worse. I would say that 3 out of 4 segments were detected, but their position and duration was quite a bit different. And that's also what we see for this night right here. According to the EEG device, I had 4 REM sleep segments and 3 of them were detected by the Garmin Forerunner 165. The first one was missed, but in this case, the duration of some of the REM sleep segments is significantly different. Still, looking at this, to me, it optically looks a bit better than the percentage that we saw in the overview would indicate. As I said, I don't want to focus on the awake moments detected by the EEG device because I do think it overestimates them. But looking at some of the longer awake moments, they do tend to agree between the EEG device and the Forerunner 165. You can see that all 4 moments detected as awake time by the Forerunner 165 were also awake moments according to the EEG device. The EEG device likely just overestimates my awake moments to some degree. So the sleep stage tracking performance of the Forerunner 165 is okay, though there are better devices out there. On me, it mostly struggles with REM sleep detection. Some of my REM sleep segments were detected, but also some of them were missed or slightly shifted compared to the EEG device. So it's up to you to decide if this kind of rough agreement is good enough for your purposes. But what might help is to compare this performance to that of many of the other devices I tested in the past. And that is exactly what we can see in this plot. Now this graph shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with different EEG and PSG reference devices. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. Now the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. Now as always, I have to say the overview is slightly complicated because I use different reference devices. The devices marked in green were tested against the ZMAX EEG device, so the one we used in this video. The devices marked in blue-purple were tested against polysomnography, the gold standard in sleep stage tracking, and the devices not marked in any color were tested against the Dream 2 EEG headband, which is my preferred reference device because it's so easy to use, but unfortunately Dream went bankrupt, so I can no longer use it. And as you can see, the Forerunner 165 marked in green right here is doing okay, though not great. It's in the middle compared to all of the other watches. There are definitely worse devices, but also definitely better devices out there. And it's quite close to other Garmin devices like the Garmin Vivo Active 5 and the Garmin Venue 3. I think all of these likely use the same algorithm and they have similar heart rate tracking performance, so they have similar performance in terms of sleep stage tracking. If we look at other reference devices, we can see that the Garmin Forerunner 255 is also very close, but the same goes for the Instinct 2 and other Garmin devices as well. So overall, about what we'd expect from a Garmin device. It's decent, though not amazing. If you want the best sleep stage tracking out there, Apple watches are doing really well, but the same goes for the H-Sleep Pod 3, the Nucor app, but this isn't available everywhere in the world, so be careful if it's really available for you. Also, different Google and Fitbit devices are performing very well. The same goes for the Oura Ring. The Whoop strap also isn't too bad. So all of these are decent choices when it comes to sleep stage tracking, and Garmin devices are just a tiny bit worse than those. So it's really up to you. How important do you find sleep stage tracking? If you like the Garmin ecosystem, it might just be good enough for you. So also when compared to the competition, the sleep stage tracking performance of the Forerunner 165 is okay, I would say. However, as I mentioned before, at least on me, there are other watches out there that perform better. For instance, Apple, Google, Fitbit, Oura and A-Sleep all make better devices. Therefore, I would give the sleep stage tracking performance of the Forerunner 165 3 out of 5 stars. Okay, moving on, let's next take a look at the GPS tracking performance of the Forerunner 165. I tested the GPS tracking by cycling the same route several times, and if the Forerunner 165 is good at GPS tracking, the different tracks should be very close to each other. Let's have a look. Let's start by looking at the results for 4 times I cycled to work. Now, I always started my ride on the corner right here, and I didn't give the watch any extra time to acquire the signal. And as you can see, 3 out of 4 times it basically acquired the signal instantly, so it's super close to the corner. And 1 time it took a tiny bit of time, but overall pretty fast and relatively accurate from the beginning. Now, if we then zoom out and look at the consistency between the signals, we see this looks pretty good. 1 time I had to take a slightly different route, but if we move on, we can see that the signals are pretty close, and then it gets better as we move along the signal. So here it looks really good. Also right here, a really good consistency between the signals. They're really quite close together. And this is honestly how it continues for most of the rides. The signals are really consistent, really close together. Not much to complain about here in general. There might be a bit of deviation right here and also near the end a bit of deviation, but actually many watches struggle a lot more right here. So this looks really good. And also right here we can see that the end is really close to where I ended it. But let's now take a look at 6 times I cycled back from work to see if we get the same quality of signal. So here we have the results for 6 times I cycled back from work. Now one time I actually started it from a slightly different position, so you cannot see that right here. But for the 5 times I did start the ride at the same location, you can see that the signal was basically acquired instantly. So that's really good. And if we then look at the consistency between the signals, this is generally pretty good. We can see a bit of deviation for one of the signals right here, but overall they're pretty consistent. And then going along the route, this looks really good. The signals stay really close together. Now I did one time have to take a bit of a different route right here, and twice I actually cycled somewhere else. So we only have 4 signals left over right here. And overall this looks pretty decent, I would say. There is some deviation, maybe a bit more than what we saw for cycling to work, but overall compared to many other watches out there, this looks really good. And then going further along the route, I would say it looks pretty good. There is some deviation right here, so a bit more than what we saw before, but overall looking pretty good still. Overall, for me, this is good enough. Always near the radio tower, we have a bit more deviation, but generally, I'm pretty happy with the consistency of the Garmin Forerunner 165, and there's really not any watch out there that's doing significantly better, at least not as far as I've seen in my testing. Okay, so the GPS tracking performance of the Forerunner 165 is really good, again showing us that Garmin has some of the best GPS tracking performance out there. I'm still thinking of ways of quantifying this performance, but qualitatively looking at the cycling tracks, I don't think there's significantly better watches out there. Therefore, I'd give the GPS tracking performance of the Forerunner 165 around 4.5 out of 5 stars. Now, before getting to my final conclusions, it is important to be aware of limitations in my testing. First of all, I just tested the Forerunner on me, so please also check other reviewers. Second, my reference device for sleep isn't perfect, though I do believe it's good enough to give us a general impression of the Forerunner's performance. And finally, as Garmin updates the firmware, things could change. For this review, I used version 6.08. Okay, but what is my final verdict on the Forerunner 165? Well, I really enjoyed using this device. I liked it about as much as my Forerunner 965, for instance, even though that is significantly more expensive. Similar to also the 265, the 965 will have some more features than the Forerunner 165. However, in terms of performance, I did not notice any significant differences. So from a bang for a buck perspective, the Forerunner 165 is a watch I can really recommend. However, if I didn't care about the AMOLED display in the 165, I might get the Forerunner 255 instead, which has a similar price, mostly similar performance, but more features. But you do lose that beautiful display in that case. Overall, I'd give the Garmin Forerunner 165 between 3.5 and 4 stars out of 5, I would say. What I like about Garmin watches is the nice ecosystem, the battery life, and also the ability to connect many different sensors and other devices. The downside of Garmin watches, at least for me, is that the sleep stage tracking isn't amazing and that the heart rate tracking during cycling doesn't do well on me. So with all these findings in mind, you should be able to make a more informed decision if this watch is the one that works best for you. Now, if you do decide to get a Forerunner 165, a Whoop strap, an Oura ring, an H-Sleep Pod 3, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, want to potentially save some money and at the same time support the channel, there are different affiliate and non-affiliate links in the description below. They do not cost you any extra and some even provide a discount. And given that you watched this whole video on the Forerunner 165, check out this video on the Garmin Venue 3 or this video on my top recommendations for sports and health tracking. Thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.